At the end of the 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s, America was swept by a huge number of protest actions. The struggle for the rights of African Americans, for women's rights, religious fighters, protests against the Vietnam War. On one side were mainly young people, students, and on the other side were law enforcement officers. The line had been crossed, and both sides had already resorted to violence multiple times. Many participants of the protests were arrested, some were in prison, and some were even killed. This made the government, the police, and the military appear as enemies in the eyes of the younger generation. Among these young people were students from the University of Berkeley, Russell Little, Joe Ramiro, and Willie Wolfe. The first two came from poor families. One of them, Joe Ramiro, had been to Vietnam and thus understood the horrors of war well. The latter, Willie Wolfe, came from a well-off family. He came to Berkeley to study anthropology but quickly became imbued with radical ideas. In 1973, there was a certain educational program for prisoners in Berkeley. Its essence was that students were allowed to teach prisoners. The nearest prison was the prison in Vacaville. There, Little, Joe Ramiro, and Willie Wolfe met a prisoner named Donald DeFries. In the eyes of the guys, the students, DeFries seemed like a good guy. He had a wife and 5 children. At that moment, he was serving a 6-year sentence for check fraud. For the guys, this seemed like a standard story of the time. Rarely could a black person get a decent job in those years, so DeFries, if you could say so, was forced to steal to feed his family. But most importantly for them, he seemed like the embodiment of that time, a black man, oppressed in his rights, forced onto a criminal path. All 3 thought about how to help this guy until Willie Wolfe said, "Listen, why not arrange an escape for him?" When all the details were discussed, the escape date was set for March 5, 1973. On that day, DeFries volunteered for the job of cleaning the heating boilers. It was the only job for prisoners that was done outside the prison fence. Somehow, DeFries managed to deceive the guards, and he was immediately picked up by a car driven by Willie Wolfe. At this stage in the story, another name appears, Mizmoon Soltysik, a girl who was part of the social circle of Little and Ramiro and Willie Wolfe. The girl also had a radical mindset. Unlike the others, she did not participate in the prisoner education program, so it was decided to hide DeFries at her place. Later, the guys thought it was dangerous to stay in Berkeley and moved DeFries to the nearest larger city, Concord. There, they rented a house for shelter. At that moment, the following were connected: Donald DeFries, Mizmoon Soltysik, Russell Little, Joe Ramiro, and Willie Wolfe. They were joined by Nancy Perry, a girl with whom DeFries corresponded while in prison, Camilla Hall, Mizmoon Soltysik's girl, and Angela Atwood. The views of these people converged. It didn't matter who stood for what, for the rights of black people, women's rights, against the war. They had one common enemy, the government. Thus, based on this idea, a whole liberation army was created. The symbol of the group became the 7 heads of a cobra. The heads signified unity, self-determination, collective work, common goods, goals, creativity, and faith. Soon, all members of the group began to acquire weapons. At this time, DeFries was thinking about how to loudly announce the group to all of America. From the previous part, we already know that the first thing that drew attention to the SLA was the loud murder of Marcus Foster. In many ways, the choice of victim seems completely illogical, the first black minister of school education. Why him? The answer lies in the fact that it was a time when there were active talks about the introduction of ID cards for school children, an analog of an identity document. DeFries, who became the leader of the SLA, believed that Foster actively supported this idea, which, by the way, is quite controversial, since many of his acquaintances claim that Foster had refused the idea of supporting the introduction of ID cards just a few weeks before the murder. One way or another, for DeFries, the introduction of identity cards for school children seemed like another attempt by the government to control the youth. It was for this reason that Marcus Foster became a victim of the SLA. On November 6, 1973, Russell Little, Joe Ramiro, and Donald DeFries, Nancy Perry, and Mizmoon Soltysik lay in wait for Foster in the parking lot. Little and Ramiro waited in the car, while Mizmoon, DeFries, and Nancy Perry attacked their victims with weapons. Ms. Moon fired the fatal shot that killed Foster. Thanks to this crime, the press began to talk about the group. The next task was to expand the ranks. For this, a lot of propaganda material was printed. However, the murder of Marcus Foster had the opposite effect. Yes, the SLA was talked about, but the murder of the first black minister of school education alienated almost all the fighters for the rights of black people. For them, Foster was precisely an example of the equality they were striving for. Those wishing to join the SLA had to be sought among acquaintances. Among them were friends of Joseph Ramiro, the married couple William and Emily Harris, young people at that time who were also dissatisfied with what was happening in the USA. They also did not approve of Foster's murder, but nevertheless, they joined the SLA. Although the group managed to hide successfully, as we already know, on January 10, 1974, the police arrested Little and Ramiro. The arrest was largely accidental, as it was just a suspicious van with two men. At that time, no one even suspected that the police had captured two members of the notorious group, and these two men would hardly have been linked to the SLA if it were not for the propaganda leaflets in the back of the van. Information about the two arrested members of the SLA quickly reached the media. Other members of the group considered it risky to stay in the same house in the city of Concord, so it was decided to leave it, but first to burn down the house itself. However, the fire was not strong enough to destroy all the things left in the house. As a result, some propaganda literature was found in the burned-down house, as well as a list that included many famous names, including the name Hearst. The paradox was that the police did not take this list seriously. No actions were taken to provide additional protection for the people on the list, which could have prevented the kidnapping of Patty Hearst. Having lost two comrades, the remaining 8 members of the group thought about how to at least try to get Little and Ramiro out of prison. Thus, the idea was born to kidnap some influential person who could be exchanged for the 2 arrested comrades. The choice fell on Patty Hearst. Defectors converged successfully here. First, as already mentioned, the group believed that the influence of her father would be enough to convince the government to make an exchange. And second, the group knew that she studied in Berkeley and also lived in the student town. It was not difficult to get to her, since almost all members of the group were students of the same Berkeley and knew this city well. And Camilla Hall even worked in the university administration. It was she who initially found out that Patty Hearst was a student at the institution. On the evening of February 4, 1974, Angela Atwood knocked on the door of the apartment where Patty lived. Her fiancé Steve Weed. As soon as Steve opened the door, Donald DeFries and Will Harris forced their way in. The kidnapping itself was described in detail in the first part of the story. It is worth adding a couple of facts. First, Patty spent the entire journey from her apartment to the SLA hideout in the trunk. And second, literally a couple of minutes after the kidnapping, the car of the SLA members with Patty in the trunk was stopped by the police. Everyone was already prepared for a shootout, but the irony of the situation was that the reason for the stop was the non-functioning rear lights. The police only made a remark to the driver about this and let him go. For the most part, we already know what happened outside the walls of the SLA house after the kidnapping from the first part of this story. Here, we will focus on how Patty Hearst turned from a frightened, naive 19-year-old student into an armed bank robber in just 9 weeks. It is important to note that the story of the events taking place at the SLA headquarters is based on the words of one of the participants in these events. Upon arrival at the place, the girl was locked in a closet, her hands were tied, and she had a blindfold over her eyes. Over time, they tried to convey to her the information that no one had anything specifically against her, that she was just a tool for achieving the group's goal. Of course, this had no meaning at first. The girl was incredibly scared, so much so that she even refused to eat. It got to the point where Nancy Perry had to sit at the same table as Patty Hearst and try the food on the table. Only then did the captive become convinced that the food was not poisoned. Most of the time with the captive was spent by the already mentioned Nancy Perry, Angela Atwood, and Willie Wolfe. Spending time with Patty, they told her about the organization's goals, why the SLA did certain things, about communism, and the like. All this was new to her, as she was only 19 years old, and before this, politics had not explicitly interested her. When Patty was locked in the closet, she was given a flashlight and literature. The group members understood that sooner or later she would have to be released, but they also wanted Patty to understand the motives behind the kidnapping. She turned out to be not what they expected, a spoiled daughter of rich parents. No, she did not ask for something impossible. She was satisfied with the minimum she had in captivity. Over time, she began to be locked in the closet only at night. More and more days she spent communicating with the members of the group. Moreover, she even began to participate in discussions of the demands for her release. If the texts of the first audio messages sent to the parents were completely dictated by DeFries, then the later messages were already Patty's improvisations. No one forced her to read from a script, they only told her the main motive of the message. She came up with everything else herself, but perhaps the most important thing that happened to Patty in captivity was that she fell in love with Willie Wolf. A very important fact to remember is that they had sex multiple times, and that Willie Wolf gave the girl an amulet in the shape of a monkey. After about 2 months of captivity, Patty Hearst was offered 2 options. Either she would be taken to a safe place and released, or she could join the SLA. She chose the second option. Of course, many things influenced this. The fact that for the last 2 months she had been told about the ideals of the group, her relationship with Willie Wolf, and the fact that she considered herself abandoned by her family when her father refused to spend $4 million on food in exchange for his daughter. On that day, Patty saw for the first time without masks the people who had surrounded her for the last 2 months. It is worth saying that the choice was difficult not only for Patty Hearst but also for the group itself. After all, unlike all the other people, Patty Hearst knew almost half of America. Therefore, in a way, she could be a burden. It was undoubtedly more difficult to hide with her as a member of the group. But one way or another, Patty Hearst became the 9th free member of the SLA group. Everyone in the group had pseudonyms. For example, DeFries called himself Sinkyu, Willie Wolf was Cujo, and Patty Hearst took the pseudonym Tonya, in honor of Che Guevara's comrade, Tonya the Guerrillera.
I would like to begin this statement by informing the public that I wrote what I'm about to say. It's what I feel. I've never been forced to say anything on any tape. I've been given the choice of 1, being released in a safe area, or 2, joining the forces of the Symbionese Liberation Army and fighting for my freedom and the freedom of all oppressed people. I have chosen to stay and fight. I have been given the name Tonya after a comrade who fought alongside Che in Bolivia for the people of Bolivia. It is in the spirit of Tonya that I say, Patria o muerte, venceremos.
Buying weapons, ammunition, printing propaganda materials, all this cost money. Until then, all expenses were covered from the personal savings of the SLA members. But by April 1974, they were exhausted. For this reason, it was decided to make another bold move to rob a bank. Moreover, to do it as loudly as possible so that all of America would talk about the SLA again. Patty Hearst's participation in the robbery undoubtedly gave that very necessary resonance. At the same time, this was supposed to be her baptism of fire. Patty became quite proficient with weapons. Nancy Perry helped her in this. As strange as it may sound, the main criterion for choosing a bank to rob was not the amount of money stored in it, but the presence of video cameras. In those years, only a limited number of banks had video cameras inside the buildings. For any other robbers, the presence of cameras only complicated the robbery, but not for the SLA. On the contrary, it was important for them that their act be as widely publicized as possible. The suitable bank eventually chosen was the Hibernia Bank in San Francisco. On April 15, 1974, the 73rd day of Patty Hearst's kidnapping, the members of the SLA arrived at the Hibernia Bank. The participants included Donald DeFries, Camilla Hall, Ms. Moon Soltysik, and Patty Hearst. These were the people who entered the bank. DeFries disarmed the guard, while Camilla Hall and Patty Hearst controlled the people inside. At this time, Mismoon, Soltysik, and DeFries collected the cash. Willie Wolf waited outside. Despite the lack of experience in such matters, all members of the group acted harshly and quickly. Good organization and determination were evident. The group only needed a few minutes to enter the bank, take the maximum amount of cash, and disappear.
Greetings to the people. This is Tanya. On April 15th, my comrades and I expropriated $10,660.02 from the Sunset branch of the Hibernia Bank. I was positioned so that I could hold customers and bank personnel who were on the floor. My gun was loaded, and at no time did any of my comrades intentionally point their guns at me. As for being brainwashed, the idea is ridiculous to the point of being beyond belief. For those people who still believe that I'm brainwashed or dead, I see no reason to further defend my position. I am a soldier in the People's Army. Patria o muerte, venceremos.
About $10,000 was stolen from the bank, a huge sum for those times. Naturally, the footage of the millionaire's daughter robbing the bank instantly became a sensation. Now it was hard to find a person in America who had not heard of the SLA. The attitude towards the group was mixed. Some still remembered the murder of Marcus Foster, but most were impressed by the actions of the SLA. There was the distribution of products and the daring bank robbery as a slap in the face to the unpopular government. The FBI looked like clowns in this situation. A group of students in broad daylight, in full view, robs one of the most guarded banks and calmly hides. Isn't this a disgrace for the security forces? But the main irony was that the SLA apartment at that time was on the same street as the FBI headquarters in San Francisco.
We've just almost turned that area upside down. I'm going to make an admission, which hurts. We don't know where she is.
But even with all that said above, staying in San Francisco was extremely dangerous. The police in the city were mobilized as never before, not only because of the SLA, but also because of other less famous, but possibly even more dangerous groups. For example, the Zebra Group, which had killed at least 15 people in 6 months. They were not connected to the SLA, but did that mean there were fewer patrols on the streets? Of course not. For this reason, it was decided to radically change the environment, and the new location chosen was Los Angeles. Of course, the choice was not accidental. It was the hometown of DeFries, the leader of the SLA. The calculation was that some of DeFries' old acquaintances would join the group, and there in Los Angeles, it would gain serious influence. But they still had to get there. A group of 3 men and 6 women would clearly seem suspicious, so it was decided to split into 3 trios and move to the new city in groups. The trios were formed as follows. The first was Will Harris, Emily Harris, and Patty Hearst. The second was Donald DeFries, Angela Atwood, and Camilla Hall, and the third was Nancy Perry, Willie Wolf, and Mismoon Soltysik. Once again, DeFries' intuition did not fail him. All 3 groups successfully made it to Los Angeles almost simultaneously. The SLA apartment in San Francisco was discovered. Items used in the bank robbery were found there, but this did not give the police anything at this stage. The FBI could only guess in which point of America the SLA group, successfully reunited in Los Angeles at 833 on 84th Street, was located. 6 women and 2 white and 1 black man would undoubtedly raise suspicions, but it was no accident that this particular area was chosen for the headquarters. After all, in those years it was a real ghetto. All sorts of things happened there. The police were not frequent guests in this area, preferring not to go there unnecessarily. On May 16, 1974, in the 3rd week of the SLA stay in Los Angeles, Emily and William Harris entered the Milo sports goods store in the suburbs of Los Angeles. They bought $30 worth of items there and headed for the exit. However, when they had already gone outside, they were stopped by 2 store security guards. One of them said to Will Harris, "Excuse me, but I need to search you." Will pulled out a revolver, but the guard skillfully knocked it out of Harris' hands. The two guards knocked Will and Emily Harris to the ground. One of them even managed to put handcuffs on one of Will's hands. Suddenly, for everyone, including Emily and Will Harris, automatic gunfire was heard. The shooting came from a van across the street. More than 100 bullets were fired at the sports goods store sign. The guards panicked and ran into the store, while Will and Emily Harris rushed to the van. The person who saved them from arrest was Patty Hearst. At the time when Emily and Will were in the store, she was waiting for them in the car. She had the keys to it. If she had wanted to return to her former life, this was the perfect chance for her. But she did not run away. Both of her comrades were impressed by Patty's determination. Not everyone could have acted like that in this situation. After this, even if anyone in the SLA had doubts about Patty, they were completely dispelled. Undoubtedly, the van was now wanted, so they needed to change the car. On the way, the fugitives saw a man in a blue apron. In this situation, this was the best option. Approaching the Pontiac, Will said, "Listen, I really don't want to do this, but I have to take your car." The man tried to resist, but upon seeing the weapon, he left the car. Thus, Will, Emily, and Patty managed to leave the area where the incident occurred. Only after a couple of hours did they realize that they had made a critical mistake. Leaving the van, the comrades took everything they thought was important, everything except one thing. In the glove compartment was a parking ticket with an address close to the area of their headquarters. The police and the FBI instantly cordoned off the area within a radius of several kilometers. This was one of the first operations in which the now well-known SWAT team was used. Moreover, it was most well prepared precisely in Los Angeles. On the morning of May 17, 1974, the FBI, police, and special forces located the SLA headquarters, House 833 on 84th Street. There was no need for an assault, as the group was always one step ahead. The house was already empty. The group had successfully escaped, but had they managed to get far? To find out, every house in the cordoned-off circle, which shrank with each newly checked house, had to be inspected. At one point, the FBI received a signal that an armed group was hiding at night in house number 1466 on 54th Street. At this moment, the security forces were closer than ever to capturing the SLA. Carefully approaching the house, the operation leader heard a voice, which he believed to be DeFreeze's. The voice was giving orders to barricade the doors and windows with furniture. At this moment, it became clear that the right house had been found. But what was to be expected next? "People in house 1466, you are surrounded. We offer you to surrender." It seemed as if this message was repeated endlessly. At one point, two people came out of the house, a boy about 8 years old and an elderly man. The man was asked, "Who else is in the house?" He replied, "Only an old black woman." When the boy was asked the same question, he replied, "There are a bunch of white people with guns in there." At this moment, it was decided to use tear gas. In response, an automatic burst was heard from the house and a woman's voice, "Hey, pigs, smoke this." At this moment, the largest shootout in the history of the USA at that time began. More than 500 people participated in the shootout on the side of the security forces. There were fewer than 10 people in the house. The security forces outnumbered them in everything. The SLA had only one advantage: they had nothing to lose. Recalling that day, one of the policemen said, "When they opened fire, I immediately fell to the ground. I was so scared that I was ready to dig up the asphalt with my bare hands to hide." From the moment the first shot was fired, none of the security forces thought about how to save the millionaire's daughter during this operation. At these moments, Patty Hearst's safety was only her concern. It was obvious that the people inside would not voluntarily leave the house. The tear gas did not give any advantage to the security forces, as the people inside had gas masks. At this moment, 54th Street turned into a real hell. It is unimaginable, but more than 4,000 bullets were fired from each side during the shootout. After 2 hours of shooting, the house began to smoke, presumably due to an exploded gas grenade. Suddenly, the door of the house opened. A black woman came out of it. The special forces instantly dragged her around the corner of the neighboring house. She had no relation to the group. She was a resident of the captured house. Very quickly, the smoke turned black. and the house was engulfed in flames. But even this did not stop them. It seemed like an endless stream of bullets from the SLA. Then the doors opened again. 2 women came out of the house. Each of them had a rifle in their hands. The first woman was hit several times in the body. Seconds later, she was already dead. It was Nancy Perry. The second woman received a precise hit to the head. Thus, Camilla Hall was killed. Her body was not far from the entrance to the house. Under the cover of DeFries and Angela Atwood, Camilla Hall's body was dragged back into the burning house. For another whole hour, the security forces and journalists watched the burning house. Even experienced policemen were puzzled. Why were these people not trying to leave it? The pride of these people was stronger, perhaps, than the strongest human instinct, the instinct of self-preservation. After an hour, it became clear that everyone who was in the house was dead. This was the death of ideological people, but it was not the death of the SLA. Then, what happened after the death of the comrades in the live broadcast was observed by 3 surviving members of the SLA.